Hi, my name is Chris Gregory. I run the spoken word audio production company Alternative Stories. We make drama, poetry, fiction, and other podcasts and radio shows, mainly around the world of literature, but increasingly working with organizations to help them to launch podcasts and think about the content and style of what they'll produce. We're an independent supplier to BBC Radio. Our drama productions have represented the UK at the International Radio Drama Festival. We have two global top 5% podcasts. And as well as managing all of this, I also teach about podcasting and writing for audio at universities and for writing foundations around the country. A couple of months ago, I led a session with leaders from the Young Archaeologists Club with the aim that group leaders would work with their members to make their own podcasts. We went through all aspects of podcast making on the day, and the process of making the podcasts has been going on since then. So for this year's Festival of Archaeology, I've been asked to give you a bit of information about the world of podcasting, a few ideas about how podcasts could work for you and your groups, and hopefully some inspiration, advice, and tips to get you started and help you to find new and creative ways to share information about the great work you're doing in archaeology. Importantly, making a pretty good sounding podcast will not be anywhere near as expensive as I know you're imagining it will be. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about microphones and how affordable they've become, but also about some of the free software that you may already have where you can record, edit, mix, and master your podcasts to get them out into the world. We're going to look at podcast platforms, how podcasts work, how they get out there to their listeners, and different types of podcasts as well. So settle down for a whistle-stop tour of podcasting and all the creativity of the world of making them. The first question I want to look at really is why podcasting? And I think the main word I would use would be accessibility. Now, in the world of the arts, and I'm sure this is true in the world of archaeology too, there are real drivers and pressure to increase accessibility, to let more people share in what we're doing and to spread the benefits of the grants that we receive and the public funding we're allocated to reach more and more people. And I think that podcasting is especially good for that. Now, podcasting, as I'm sure many of you realize, is hugely popular at the moment. So it falls into that category of on-demand media. We consume podcasts in the same way that we view content from Netflix or BBC iPlayer and other streaming services. And that really means whenever and wherever we want, so long as we have a Wi-Fi signal and a device to view or listen on. Now, crucially for podcasts, they fit in particularly well with our busy lives, more so than visual content. So we can listen to podcasts whilst doing other things, whilst driving or cooking. We've seen a real increase in people listening to podcasts during the working day. And this started during the pandemic as people began to work more from home. So completely contrary to what you might expect, the busiest days for our podcasts are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. That must mean that people are listening while they're working. Smart speakers and voice-activated car media players make it easy for us to find, select, and play podcasts. And services like Spotify allow us to make podcast playlists so we can stack up the pods we want to listen to ahead of a long car journey, for example. Podcasting not only helps the time poor, which is probably most of us if we're honest, but can also be great for those who are less able to read newsletters and books. And that could be because of sight issues or simply not being able to afford expensive academic books and journals. Podcasts have a huge reach, and once published, they're immediately available all around the world. So when the Arts Council, in many of the cases I've been working on, say, well, how is your project going to spread itself out and become accessible to lots of people? Podcasting could answer that question. I'm sure that is the same as in the world of archaeology. So let's think about how that could work for you. Let's think of an example of someone in the United States researching their family roots in the UK and wanting to find out a little more about where their forebears came from and the history of that place. So if they find the podcast that you've made about the ancient history of Sodding Chitbury or wherever, that may be of huge interest to them. But your local printed newsletter may not have been accessible to them in the same way. Podcasts have great findability, if that's a word, in search engines. Podcast platforms generally have great algorithms allowing people to find your content. And if you think about it, it's in their interest to drive listeners to download your content from them rather than their rivals. So they'll spend a lot of money and time developing the metadata. That's all the behind the scenes information that search engines look for behind your podcast. So it makes it very easy for people to find it. So, for example, if you make a podcast about Little Whimpering Hill Fort, that could become one of the first things that people searching for the hill fort in Google might find. Often more so than the scholarly article you wrote about the fort, but that got buried deep within the annals of the Little Whimpering Gazette back in November 2003. I think there's another thing about podcasts in that they are capable of generating little communities of listeners. Have any of you heard the BBC's Uncanny podcast? So for those of you who haven't, Uncanny deals with stories about ghosts and the supernatural. And it follows on from shows like the Battersea Poltergeist and the Witch Farm on Radio 4. They're all written and presented by a guy called Danny Robbins. And watch out, Danny is bringing Uncanny to TV soon as well. So I was chatting with Danny at the podcast show in London a few weeks ago. And two things really struck me. First, that his shows have really brought out a community of people interested in ghosts and the generally spooky. Not just believers, as you might expect, but also skeptics. They have a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Uncanny Community. And they kind of playfully divide their listeners into team believer and team skeptic. So there's something in it for a wider range of listeners than you might think. So a podcast like that can generate and nurture its following in ways that might be more difficult for a printed publication or a traditional radio or TV show to do. But secondly, the other thing that Danny was saying was about the portable nature of podcasts. So you can listen wherever your phone is. And that means that fans of his shows actually go to spooky places to listen to them. They heighten their listening experience and probably scare themselves stupid in the process by going to graveyards or ruins and popping on their headphones to immerse themselves in the experience. And it occurred to me that that would work really well for something like archaeology or history podcasts too. Not that we want the general public stumbling around important ongoing dig sites, but certainly if you've made a podcast about Kirby Muxloe Castle, for example, or Danebury Hill Fort, what better place to listen to those podcasts than whilst wandering around those sites? So your podcast can literally transport listeners and give them a fantastic immersive experience if they listen in situ. So you've decided to make a podcast. If you've listened to lots of podcasts, which I'm sure many of you have, you'll know that they can take a number of forms and formats. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking to you about some popular formats that I think would work particularly well for archaeology podcasts. Now, as with everything about podcasting, it is very much a developing form of media. And you may have fantastic ideas that don't conform to anything that I'm about to tell you. Do not be afraid to experiment. And I think that's really important in the world of podcasting. It's a world that really rewards experimentation. So have a go, do the different, do the interesting, and see how it works. But let's stick to some tried and trusted formats. Um, so I think the first one, and this is really common in the world of podcasting. So if you've ever listened to a podcast, you'll know about this one. And this is really just two people or three people having a chat or a conversation about a topic. That could be a recent film or a TV show, a sports team, could be cookery, travel, politics, art. You get the picture. It's a versatile and well-used format. Now, your presenters generally need to be quite knowledgeable about the subject, although there is a strand of podcasts like this where the opposite is true. And the vibe there really, I think, is that you are learning as these presenters are learning. So they might be getting guests in and talking to them, asking about particular topics and learning as they talk. And that's quite an attractive format as well. But let's assume, I think, for the world of archaeology, that probably your presenters are quite knowledgeable. And so what you're going to get here is two people having a chat about, I don't know, a particular a site or a period of history, a method of or approach to archaeological digs or investigations. The trick, I think, with podcasts like this is that they should sound very conversational. This is not a scripted radio show. They want to sound natural, off the cuff, the sort of conversation that you could walk into in a really good pub. And I think that whilst you can sound off the cuff and natural, and some people have the skill to just do that without any preparation, I would argue that it would be a good idea to have a meeting with your co-presenter beforehand, chart out roughly where your conversation's going to go, a few pointers as to topics, where you want it to go to, and that will be like a little roadmap that you can use as you talk. Another popular format, which many of you will also have heard, is the interview podcast. And usually this is one or two interviewers with a guest who is an expert on a particular subject. Now, these can range as well in from the Jeremy Paxman style mauling of a politician. I suggest you steer away from that one. To very, very conversational chats with someone who knows a little bit more than the interviewer does generally about a specific topic. So with that in mind, and that may well be a format that you go with, let's think a little bit about interviewing. And I'm going to give you a few tips about interviewing. Now, the first one is that as the interviewer, it's not about you, much as you might like to think it is. So keep your questions concise and unambiguous where possible. Let your guests do the talking. That's the reason you've got them on. Try not to interrupt your guest. Give them every opportunity to display and impart their knowledge. It's your job to put them in the best possible light and to get as much knowledge from them for your listeners. So lead them gently to the areas that you are interested in and that you think your listeners will be interested in. Now, to help that process, I think it's a good idea to sketch out your questions well ahead of the interview and share them with your guest. The reason for that is that I think that can often help them to prepare for the interview and to speak more knowledgeably and authoritatively when the microphones are on and you're recording. Other things I've seen with interviewers that prepare really well is that they'll bring along, in some of my cases, they'll bring along a poetry collection and they'll have a little bookmark and they can open it during the interview and say, here's an example. And I'm sure your guests will be able to do that as well. So it gives you a much more prepared and authoritative conversation. Now, that's not to say that you need to script it so rigidly that you never feel that you can go off piste and follow up questions. I would always argue that it's great to, generate little sub-conversations within your interview. But it's always handy to know that you've got this structure to go back to. And you'll never have that sort of slightly embarrassed silence where you're thinking, well, what the hell do I ask next? Another tip for interview podcasts is always to have a little chat before you start your formal recording. That does two things for you. Often, as the interviewer, you're also going to be the one doing the actual recording. So you might have a laptop with your recording software, and you'll be able to monitor the sound on that. So that's the first thing. As you have your little preliminary chat, look at the sound levels. Get your interviewer to move a little bit closer to the microphone if they're sounding soft, or if they've got a really loud voice, get them to back away a little bit so your sound is at an optimum level. And the same's true for your own sound as well. So you're doing a little sound check there. But also in the process of doing that sound check, you're having a conversation and getting the interviewee used to having this microphone in their face, which can be quite disorientating for the first little while. So you're getting some of that unfamiliarity over with before you press that big red record button. Finally, there's lots more tips about interviewing, but finally, just for this little section, always be prepared to do some editing afterwards. We as human beings will and will burp, cough, fart, and make other unsavory sounds. Do your interviewee the courtesy of editing out as many of theirs as you can in post-production. And while you're at it, trim a few of your ums and ers too. You're going to make your interview sound much more fluent and fluid, much more engaging for your listeners, and it's going to sound a lot more professional. And that's what you're in the business of, trying to make yourself both sound as professional and like you know what you're talking about as possible. Another format that I think that would work especially well for podcasts about archaeology and featuring the work of archaeology groups would be the magazine format. So if you can imagine that that's a little bit like the format of a show like Newsnight on the television, a single presenter introducing a selection of features. And those features could be in-depth reports from different parts of the world, interviews with a politician, conversations with an expert about the day's news. In your case, that could be recent digs that your society has done, expertise of your society's members, what your Young Archaeologist Club section is up to. Bring that all together with a nicely scripted presenter script, and someone with a great voice to present it. And you're going to get a nice sounding, far-ranging sort of magazine, a bit like the sort of magazine you could buy off the shelf in W.H. Smith or wherever. And a final format that I'm going to talk about today, and again, there are many more of these, would be the in-depth single topic podcast format. This is where you literally pick, I don't know, one period of history or one dig, something that you can really go in depth on. So for something like that, first of all, I would say, make sure there is lots to talk about. You don't want to run out of things to say. Make sure that you know as much as you possibly can about it. Remember, I talked about those search algorithms that once you've put out a podcast about Little Whimpering Hill Fort, never try to find Little Whimpering Hill Fort, by the way, you will become well found on Google and other search engines. So make sure you know what you're talking about if you're going to do something like this. Go in depth, be as nerdy as you want to about it, because your audience is going to love that. You're talking to your peers, you're talking to other people that are interested in this topic. So bring on guests, bring on people from other archaeology clubs that may know a little bit more about one aspect of it than you do, and really go to town on this topic. Now, because of the nature of this and the research you're going to need to do, you may not want to be doing a different in-depth topic every week. So your podcast format, if you're going to do shows like this, might need to be monthly or just an irregular format, because of the amount of work you're going to need to do. But something like this can become really important, actually, academically and for anyone researching your particular topic. So make it good, and just enjoy yourself. Just the one thing that will make your listeners keep listening, and this applies to all of the formats, is your enthusiasm. There's nothing worse than a bored sounding presenter. So do all the vocal inflections, do your vocal warm up, and really get into your topic, and just enjoy it. And that will come across. I want to talk a little bit about podcast length. One of the most common questions that I get asked when I talk about podcasting is, what is a good length for a podcast? And the answer is that there really isn't a definitive answer. So in the world of poetry, I've made podcasts that are just one poem long, 2 minutes. But I've made other discussion podcasts that go on for well over an hour. Unlike in the world of radio, we don't need to fit neatly between news bulletins or finish on the dot at 3 o'clock because the football's starting. Now, that doesn't mean we should go on and on until we run out of things to say. As with everything, while it's interesting, keep going, but learn to be a good editor or interviewer. Learn to draw things to a close when you feel things are starting to drift. It's generally better to leave your audience wanting a little bit more than to feel like they've just listened to two blokes, and it is always blokes, rambling for way longer than was necessary. I want to talk now a little bit about the way in which podcasting works. And what I mean by that is how a podcast gets from your computer where you've recorded it into the ears of your listeners. Now, as you may know, if you listen to a lot of podcasts, there are hundreds of platforms on which you can listen. So platforms or apps, as lots of people call them. Now, the most popular of those is Apple Podcasts. I'm sure if many of you have an iPhone, you might well listen on Apple Podcasts. But you can also listen on platforms like Spotify. There is a Google Podcasts. Amazon has got in on this, unsurprisingly. So you can listen on Amazon Music. There are apps that are specifically for Android phones like Stitcher, and players like Audible, the audiobook people, are also not only putting out podcasts but also commissioning their own original podcasts, which is quite interesting. Now, as a podcaster, your aim is obviously to be heard as widely as you possibly can be. And that's going to mean that you want to be on as many of those podcast apps and platforms as you can possibly get onto. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the way that it works, the way that your podcast gets to those different platforms and therefore into the ears of your listeners. And the first starting point actually is a podcast host. Now, we have to do a little bit of disambiguation here, because a podcast host in this context is an online platform that stores and distributes your podcast. Now, the reason we need to disambiguate this is that a podcast host can also be a person who is the host of a podcast. So let's park that for a moment. We'll always refer to that person as the presenter rather than the host, but I know it is confusing. So a podcast host at this point is a company, an online platform that allows you to upload, edit in some cases, and distribute your podcast. Now, the role of the podcast host, they do lots of different things, as I've mentioned. So let's just go through those one by one. So firstly, they store your podcast episodes, in most cases indefinitely, so long as you keep paying your monthly fee, folks. But there are some podcast hosts that offer a free service that will only keep your podcast for a certain while. So 90 days, for example, would be typical of that. And you need to decide whether that's long enough or whether you want your podcast to be there forever. They also store a set of general information about your podcast, which will be shared each time your podcast is listened to. So that will be written notes about the podcast, the name of the podcast, something called an RSS feed, which allows podcast apps to learn about your podcast. Also, the categories that your podcast fits into. We'll talk a bit more about that shortly. They allow a link to your podcasts to go to all the different platforms and apps where you'd like it to be heard. They will distribute new episodes of your podcast to those apps and platforms each time you drop a new episode. They can provide a mini podcast website for you so that people can easily find your content and listen to it from that website. They provide different shareable links to your podcast so that listeners can go directly to it on your podcast host. And those links actually are really useful because they're very easily shareable on Twitter or wherever you want to post them. And it literally means that people can go from a tweet about the latest edition of your podcast to be listening to that podcast almost instantly. And this is another beauty of podcasting, in that your podcasts are very, very shareable. They can go viral very quickly. They can be shared by lots of people over a very short period of time. Podcast hosts also can provide embeddable links so that you can share your podcast episodes on your organization's website or blog, which again can be very useful. So if you're writing a blog about a particular hill fort or dig that you've been involved in, and you've made a podcast about that dig, you can put an embedded link to that podcast and people can go straight to it from your blog, which is really handy. They also provide a huge range of statistics on the listening habits of your audience, how often your podcast listened to, where it's listened to, what apps and devices people are using to listen, so that you can get an idea of how well you're doing and learn stuff about your audience, which can be really useful. They can also link you to further stats about your podcast performance. And these are the stats that are kept by individual platforms such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And you can really drill down into stats. So one of the scary ones is how long are people listening to your episode for? And you know that if every week they're turning off after about 20 minutes, maybe you're outstaying your welcome, or maybe there's a feature that always comes in at 20 minutes that people aren't enjoying. So stats like that, as well as really, scaring you a little bit as a podcaster, can also help you to hone your content and make it more acceptable to your audience. A few things then about choosing a podcast host. And like many things in life, this is going to be a balance, and you're balancing the cost of using that podcast host versus the convenience and the versatility that they offer you. You want a host that will get your podcast onto as many of these platforms and apps as possible, allow you to upload as much content as you would like at the lowest possible monthly cost, and also look at the uptime record. You don't want your host to be one that is often down because of technical problems. So make sure that you have a very available host so that anytime listeners want to listen to your content, they can. You don't want them to miss out on potential downloads for long periods of time. So I'm not going to recommend any particular host here. I'll give you a few names. A service that used to be called Anchor FM is now called Spotify for podcasters. It's a good and cheap startup host for podcasters. The functionality is not as rich as on many others, but actually I've used it quite a bit, and I think it's quite a good platform. It does err towards Spotify, as you'd expect from the name. Buzzsprout is one I've used quite a lot. That offers different tiers of membership, from a free service that only keeps your content for 90 days to one costing around £15 a month. And it gets it onto lots and lots of different platforms and is very easy to use and provides lots and lots of very rich statistics for podcasters that services like Anchor FM, or sorry, Spotify for podcasters, as it's now called, don't necessarily offer. Look out also for some of the smaller players like Podbean, Libsyn is another good one. There's lots out there. New ones are popping up all the time. So this is probably out of date from the moment I've finished recording it. So do your homework. Go onto Google and investigate podcast hosts and podcast platforms, and find out what might be the best one for you. So once you've chosen your host, what do you do next? Well, first of all, you've got to do a bit of work to set up your podcast. And the good news is that this is a one-off piece of work. So let's go through some of the things that you're going to need to do to actually set up your podcast. Now, really importantly, you need a unique and a very good name for your podcast. Your name should ideally describe exactly what your podcast is about in as few words as possible, so that listeners can easily find it. So I would argue there must be hundreds of podcasts out there called the Archaeology podcast or Archaeology pod and things like that. So steer clear of things like that. Do a bit of research to, when you've got a name, make sure that you then put that into Google and make sure no one else is using it, because you don't want to tread on toes and you want your podcast to easily be found. If you're making it on behalf of a society, that society will usually be associated with a particular place or a particular topic. So perhaps the name of your society followed by podcast might work quite well. That might be a little bit too literal for you, but I think, it will do what it says on the tin. And there's a lot to be said for that. So do think about what you want your podcast to be called, because that is really important. Look up the subject lists, and these are universal lists and they are administered by Apple. So place your podcast into categories according to your show's subject matter. And so the best thing to do here is look at other popular archaeology podcasts and look at the categories that are listed against them. And that's probably going to be the right place to put your podcast. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do that here, because there might be some cases where you want your podcast to be in different categories. So think about that. So history might be a great place for your podcast, or in some cases even geography or places could be the best place for your podcast to be found. So really do think about that. It is important because those are the search terms that your listeners might use to find you. So spend a bit of time researching those lists, and finding out where other popular podcasts in your area, what lists they're in. Upload a description of your show. That's really important. Describe your podcast and what it's going to do in the shortest, the fewest number of words, but make it a good description that people will know what they're going to get. Also importantly, and again, if anyone's familiar with podcasts, you'll know that they all have a little square graphic associated with them. Now make that good. Make the title of the graphic of the podcast appear in the graphic, if you possibly can. And bear in mind that those graphics can often be viewed really, really small. So if you're searching for podcasts on your phone, they are going to be tiny. So make your graphics stand out. Make the wording of the title of your show big within the graphic if you possibly can. But also make the graphic high enough quality that Often when you zoom in on the podcast or when you listen to it, the icon becomes much, much bigger. So it needs to be in quite good resolution so that it looks good, tiny or big. And that's quite a challenge, I think, but it is worth spending a bit of time. And if someone in your group has got a bit of background in graphic design, they may be a good person to get involved at this point. For your account information, you will need an email address. You need to be accountable for your content, and podcast hosts will insist on this because what they don't want is people uploading questionable material. So accountability is important. So you will need an email address. Now, most importantly, and probably time consumingly as a one-off job, you will need to do a bit of work behind the scenes to link your podcast from your podcast host to all of the platforms where you want it to appear. Now, your podcast host will guide you through that process. They'll issue you with what's called an RSS feed. That's a unique link to your podcast and all the information behind it, which you can then share via links that your host provides to all the different platforms you'd like it to appear on. When you've shared your podcast, there will often be a short wait while podcast platforms and apps review and approve it. Some are quicker than others. Apple Podcasts, which remember is the one you really want to be on, can take 2 to 3 weeks to actually approve your podcast. So factor that time in. Don't imagine that you can set your podcast up and release episode 1 immediately. You're going to need to have a little bit of a lag time. But you will get a notification via email when your show has been approved. And at that point, you can start to say, right, I'm on Google, I'm on Apple, I'm on Spotify. Now is a good time. Now is the right time to release my first episode. I mentioned before that one of the things that your podcast host will do is to provide you with lots and lots of stats. Now, those stats will become obviously more meaningful the more episodes you have out. So just a graphic here about the types of stats that you're going to get. And they are from simple ones like the number of downloads that your podcast has received, to where people are listening. And that goes not just down to country, but down to towns and cities within countries. You can get quite nerdy about where your audience is. Lots and lots of other stats, as you can see. So get a podcast host that will give you those really rich stats, because not only are they nice to know, but actually with a bit of thought, you can actually learn important stuff from those stats. A little bit now about what happens when you upload an episode. So this graphic just shows you about the process of that. So for each episode, you'll upload fundamentally an audio file, an MP3 that is the podcast that you've made on your computer and you now want to share with the world. Also, you're going to need the show notes. Now, this is the written set of notes, effectively the credits, I guess, for your podcast. So that's going to have details about who presented it, who your guests were. It's often a courtesy to put Twitter links to your guests, or links to their own podcast if they're already a podcaster, or their website. You can put clickable links into these show notes, which is really handy, because if your listeners have been grabbed by what you're saying, they can perhaps click on the link to your archaeology club or society, your the Department of Archaeology in the university where you work. So get straight to you so they can find you. Your social media, all of those things, and those clickable links are so invaluable. If you've made a really long episode, you can put content markers within that. And so those content markers will effectively say behind the scenes, the bit where I talked about Sodding Chipbury churchyard begins at 23 minutes. So if you're only interested as a listener in that bit, I can click on that marker and go straight to that content. Most podcast hosts allow you to link to advertising content that will play at certain points in your podcast. This can generate you revenue for your podcast. And certainly and clearly, if you're receiving thousands of downloads, that's going to be more attractive to advertisers than podcasts that have a very niche audience of 20, but very dedicated audience. Probably you're not going to be looking at advertising on your podcast when you start out. So something that's there that will may be useful for you later. Some podcast platforms allow you to have a trailer for your podcast, and that will be the first thing you see. So Spotify, for example, if you and I would argue it's a really great idea to make a short trailer about your podcast. The first thing, the reason why that's a good idea is because it lets listeners understand what your podcast is about. So if they go on to Spotify and look at the little whimpering Archaeology Club podcast, they'll get a trailer where you talk about the podcast, maybe give a snippet or two from upcoming episodes. And that can be a 2 or 3 minute trailer setting out your stall as to what your podcast's about. Something that a lot of podcasters do is to do what's called a trailer swap. So I'll play your trailer for your podcast if you put mine out. And that can often grow your audience quite a lot, because the audience of the next town's archaeology club may start to listen to your podcast if they've heard their trailer, and vice versa. And a little thing also about thinking about when you schedule your podcast for release. So when you upload your new podcast, you'll be asked, do you want to release it right now, or do you want to schedule it for the future? Now, one thing that I always do is to schedule for a point in the future. For example, I always release my podcasts at 4 o'clock in the morning, and usually on a Thursday or Friday. The reason I schedule for 4 o'clock in the morning, remember I've said that from your host, your podcast is then going to kind of filter and percolate out to all the different apps and platforms where people were listening. Now, that isn't necessarily an instant process. It takes a little bit of time. So if I drop my podcast, as the young people say, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I can be pretty sure that by breakfast time, it will be on all of the platforms where people may want to listen. And so they can listen on their drive into work. Now, also what I've noticed is that often I get a load of listeners from the West Coast of America. This is where time zones can be slightly odd, but also work in your favor. So by dropping it at 4 o'clock in the morning, that's around about bedtime where they are, and they listen at bedtime, which is lovely to think about. So think about when you drop your podcast, be consistent. If you start to generate an audience, that audience will appreciate the fact that your podcast always comes out on a Friday, and it's always available for breakfast time on a Friday. And that becomes, as the more they get attached to your podcast, the more that becomes part of their weekly habit. They will look forward to it. They will come to expect it. So, if you're not going to drop one, then let them know the week before that there isn't going to be a podcast next week. Sorry, folks, we'll be back to normal the week after. A little bit about download numbers. Now, as with everything else in life, unfortunately, there is a bit of work you need to do to generate an audience for your podcast. The first podcast you release will probably mostly be heard by friends and family. Other members of your society will listen. And really, it's very important that you encourage them to tell their friends about it. Share it on social media, share it on Facebook. Let people they know from other archaeology groups and societies know about it. The more work you do to publish your podcast, the more listeners you will get. When you tell people about your podcast, the key message is to get them to subscribe. When they subscribe in their favorite podcast app, that app will tell them every time you release a new episode. It will lead them to that new episode. You don't want them to have to go around and try and find it every time you drop a new episode. You want it to be delivered to them. And it's a bit like when you subscribe to a magazine, it just drops through your letterbox once a month. So subscribe is the important message. Get the word out there as widely as you can. Use tricks like trailer swaps with other like-minded podcasts, as I've mentioned. Do a press release to your local paper. Try and get on the local radio if you can to talk about your podcast. Use all the tricks that you can to get the word out about your podcast, to generate your audience. One thing that's really interesting, actually, is that Apple Podcasts, where most of your listeners will find your work, has charts, and it really favors new podcasts. So try and get as many listeners as you can in the first few weeks, and you'll find that your podcast will appear in the Apple charts, because the chart has a bias towards subscribers rather than downloaders. So if you're getting lots of new subscribers, I think a subscribe is worth something like 20 downloads. So you can see that a new podcast where everyone who listens is probably subscribing has that bias, that the ability to get into the podcast charts. Now, by being in the podcast charts, that will give you visibility to people that are beyond the reach of your friends, family, and little local network. You'll see people that are interested in archaeology podcasts from all around the world start to notice your icon, your podcast, appearing in their feed, and they'll click on it and have a listen. So get in the charts if you possibly can by pushing the early episodes of your podcasts. I would say manage your expectations. Do not expect huge numbers of listeners first when you first launch your podcast. One thing that people who've got lots of podcasts out there, like me, one of my podcasts has over 130 episodes. One of the advantages of that for listens and downloads is that if someone discovers it, they can binge 130 episodes. Whereas when you're starting out, there's only 2 episodes out there, for example, for people to binge. So the max number of binge listens you're going to get is 2. You'll see your numbers grow as you get more and more episodes out there. Remember also that selective appeal does not necessarily mean that no one's interested. It means that the right people are interested, people that are interested in archaeology and listen to podcasts. So with an audience of 100, you can be the definitive voice on a topic, the podcast that everyone who's into that bit of archaeology, and you know it's a small world because you meet the same people every time you go to a conference on that topic. But if they're all listening to your podcast, you can be that definitive voice on that topic. Spread the word about it to those peers that you meet at all those conferences. Get them listening. Invite them to come onto your podcast as guests. Think about ways in which you can organically grow your podcast, and you will start to see more and more listeners. A few thoughts on being on this side of the microphone if you're going to be the presenter of your own podcast. And I think that, that it's a very rewarding thing to do, but it doesn't come naturally for everyone. So think about who might be the best person to present your podcast. I would say, like anything, preparation and rehearsal are really important. You want to present your podcast, the information, in the best possible light. So you're going to want to put as much life into it as you can. when you look at your scripts, look at the rises and falls, the places where you want to get real excitement across to your listeners, and the more reflective passages where you want to introduce a speaker or a topic that might not be quite so exciting, but look for the light and shade in the script that you prepare for yourself. And a really important point there, I think, is do make a script for your podcast, particularly if you're going to be doing a magazine style podcast and you're going to have a presenter. So give them a script, and get them to stick to it if you can. Get them to do a vocal warm-up before they start. This is something that's always hilarious the first time you do it. But when I work with actors have all got their own individual warm-ups. And it's important that we do a warm-up. Make sure that you're relaxed before you start to record, and make sure that you do a few vocal exercises. So one that I always do is just to repeat this phrase: pepperoni macaroni, pepperoni macaroni. It's not very good for vegans, I'm afraid. Move on then to mozzarella gorgonzola. Really chew those words, get your jaw moving, get your tongue moving. Make sure you've got a glass of water to hand as well. But prepare for your moment in front of the microphone, and you will sound as good as you possibly can be. Now, for this next section, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kit. This may get a little bit nerdy, so I do apologize for that up front. I'm going to talk to you about two different sorts of microphones that you may wish to acquire. Now, for the purpose of this, I will just talk about two models. I might show you a few more as well, but they're both what are called condenser microphones. Now, condenser microphones are what is used generally for studio recording. They are extremely sensitive microphones, and they have what's called a wide cardioid pattern. That's the area in front of the microphone where they will pick up sound from. If you ever see a band playing, the singer will have a what's called a dynamic microphone, and the pattern of sound for that microphone will be much narrower, which is why often singers are very, very close to the microphone. But with a microphone like this one, I don't need to be that close and it will pick it up nicely. So the two models I'm going to talk about are this one that I'm using called the Rode NT1A, which you could probably pick up for around £150. But there are way, way cheaper versions of that, and I'll talk about price range shortly. And another one called the Blue Yeti, which also has a smaller version called the Blue Yeti Nano. So both of those microphones, and sorry, the Blue Yeti will retail for around £100, and you'll find that on the website named after a South American river and rainforest. The beauty of the Blue Yeti is that it just connects to your computer via a USB cable. Comes with a little stand, and it is everything you need to start recording. So that's really good. So £100 and you're up and going. I'll talk about the software that you'll use shortly. Both of these microphones offer broadcast quality sound. So I've had stuff recorded on each of these types of microphones that have appeared on BBC Radio. The Rode is slightly higher quality, but it requires more peripheral kit. So as you can see from this diagram, that's probably the main difference, really. The Rode mic, this one, requires an interface box. It requires cabling between the microphone and the interface box, a USB lead to connect the interface box to your computer. Also, unlike the Blue Yeti, you will need some sort of a microphone stand for the Rode to stand on. So with all the kit, then probably the cost of the Rode microphone will be exceeding £200, whereas the Blue Yeti, you'll get everything you need for around 100. Now, I said there are lots and lots of options there. So in both of those categories, so USB microphones like the Blue Yeti and microphones that require an interface box and separate cable, there are all sorts of options. So I'm just going to do a short run through of some of the other microphone options you might want to consider. So a really good one that would be a great substitute for the Rode at a smaller price is this one. This is called an Audio-Technica AT 2020. Again, on the Rainforest and River site, you will probably find one of these for around about 80 to 85 pounds. Really, really high quality audio from these. There are all shapes and sizes of microphones. So this is also an Audio-Technica microphone. It's also a condenser microphone. Again, you know, these are often much more portable than the one I've just shown you, actually. So you might want to consider one that looks like that as well. You need something for your microphone to sit in. So there are all sorts of clips and stands for your microphone to sit in. I would recommend, if you're going to be using a condenser microphone like the Audio-Technica, to get what's called a shock mount. I've said that these things are very, very sensitive microphones, and I don't know if you can see, but this shock mount is mounted on a kind of basket work of elastic, so that it moves independently of the mount. So if you kick your mic stand, never kick your mic stand, kids, this will not break your microphone in the process, so it floats nicely in there. You can also see that attached to that is something called a pop screen. There's one here as well. This is the thing that allows you to prevent those loud P and B sounds. When we make P and B sounds, a rush of air comes out of our mouth. And if that goes straight into the microphone, you will hear distortion and really horrible noises. So the job of the pop screen is to stop those sounds. And we can also go belt and braces with one of these good old foam covers that you always see on microphones for news reporters and things like that. We sometimes call these microphone condoms. I wouldn't recommend you give them that name, just call them a foam cover. You can also get special wind covers, which are furry. So if you're outdoors and you're recording, those furry wind covers, again, they've got a horrible name. They're called dead kittens. Don't call them that, kids. They are essential because they will stop the wind noise in your microphone. Now, a little bit about outdoor recording. It is a bit of a minefield, and but if done well, I think it can be really good and evocative for your listeners. So if you are doing a feature on a particular local site, why not actually go to that site to record? Now, you could take your laptop with you and record using the battery on your laptop, or you could go for an option like this. So this is called a Zoom H6 recorder, and it just runs on batteries. So and not, you know, specialist batteries. This one runs on 4 AA batteries and will allegedly give, you know, more than 10 hours of recording on those batteries. It's a great bit of kit, not only because it has a series of microphones that you can buy for it. So this is what's called an XY microphone pair. As you can see, they're microphones pointing in different directions. So they might be quite good for an interview. So I'm speaking into this one. The interviewer is speaking into that one. Or also good for picking up the sound around where you're speaking from. And that's what's going to give the color and the local feel that you are actually out and about to your listeners. So a bit of bird song, a bit of wind noise, road nearby, you can tell when a recording is outdoors. It has a particular dynamic quality to it. And it can be really good to record outdoors if you possibly can. Make sure that you get a foam cover to go over this if you're going to be doing recording outdoors to stop the wind sound. Now, one of these are pricey, I think, around about £300. There are much, much cheaper models than that. So do investigate the market. One of the other things that you might want to consider is, again, look on a site like the Rainforest site. You can buy little microphones that clip onto your phone. And they either, if you're on an iPhone, they'll clip into the little recharger, the lightning connector on your iPhone, or sometimes into the headphone socket on your microphone on your phone, and you can record through that straight onto your phone using a better microphone than the one that's actually built into your phone. So there are lots and lots of options there. You can even make a reasonably good quality recording using the phone, the microphone on your phone. So experiment with that. The tip I would say is, if you are going to use your phone for recording, don't handhold the phone as you're doing so. Put it on a table in front of you, maybe raise it up with a couple of books so it's quite near to your mouth, the source of the recording, and investigate how you can, for the recording software on your phone, you can usually up the quality of the recording. So recording the best quality you can, and get yourself into a nice quiet place and just experiment with recording on your phone. Maybe that you can get a good quality recording without having to make any outlay for microphones. Just one final thing about microphones. I have supplied microphones to interviewees that we've interviewed on Zoom, and all of these things can be connected up to Zoom, which is great actually, because sometimes you want to record someone who's not physically close to you, and you don't want to necessarily transport them across the country. So record your interviews on Zoom. That can work really well. But I've supplied microphones that cost me 30 quid that have sounded almost as good as something that I've paid £200 for. So, have a look on around, see what you can find, and you will find really good quality recording kit for not very much money, and some of it's really good. Now, I mentioned that there is free software that you can use for making your recording and editing it and mixing it afterwards. And I'm going to talk about two bits of software that are free. The first of them, if you are lucky enough to be an Apple Mac user, or if you're in the Apple family of products, so iPhones and iPads and that sort of thing, there is some software that you may have noticed called GarageBand. Now, GarageBand, as the name suggests, was invented to record music. So it has an icon actually, which is like a guitar. But it works equally well for recording spoken word content as well. It is a multi-track recording studio, really, a digital recording studio, and it is free if you have an Apple Mac. So go to the Mac Store. If it's not already on your Mac, go to the Mac Store and you can download that software and use it. And as I said, it can be used. So if you're at home, if you've got your laptop, you can record directly into it. And the beauty of it is that it also, the same software allows you to do all the editing you need. So remember earlier I was talking about editing out the ums and ers, the burps, the coughs, the farts, the sneezes. It will allow you to do that as well. It also allows you to bring in external recordings. So if someone from your group has recorded something on a site, on a dig, and they've sent that into you as an MP3, you can import that MP3 into GarageBand edit it so all the nasty noises aren't there anymore, and Brian from the club isn't repeating himself every 2 minutes. Make a nice recording of it, and then edit that into your finished podcast. So it allows you to do all of that. I'll give you a few little notes on how to use a digital audio workstation. There are degree courses on this sort of thing, so I won't go into that much detail, but there are also lots and lots of YouTube videos that you can find about it as well. So I'll point you at those. Now, the other thing, the other bit of software, so if you're a PC user, the software I'd recommend is called Audacity. You can just go to, I'll put a link down here for finding Audacity. And again, it works in a very similar way to GarageBand. So go out and get some of that software, play around with it, experiment with it. It will give you everything you need to record, mix, edit, and make a final podcast. I just wanted to share a quick look at a chart I made for the Young Archaeologist Club leaders about the typical format for a magazine-style podcast. So as you'll see, this chart shows where the presenter will be speaking, a guide to what they might be saying, where the intro and outro music might come in, the types of features they might have included, and notes on the timing of these pieces for the running order. Now, if you work to a plan like this, putting your own slant on it, you should be able to make interesting and varied podcasts that your listeners will enjoy. I always think that it's worth spending a few minutes in the planning stage to get a podcast that hangs together well, has a nice flow, and that your listeners will enjoy hearing. It's very tempting to just dive in and ad lib, as I'm doing now, and you tend to get lots of ums and ums. So do a bit of scripting, not too much, and I think you'll get a tighter, better sounding podcast. As I said though at the start of this talk, don't be afraid to experiment. Do your own thing. Who knows, you might find yourself making a podcast that thousands of people listen to every week. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to my whistle-stop tour through the world of podcasting and have found it interesting and inspiring. If you have any further questions, you can find out more about me and my company and listen to some of the podcasts we've made by visiting my website at alternativestories.com, which is all one word. If you're interested in my podcast setup service, I would like an initial consultation to talk through your requirements, please drop me a note either via my website or at office@alternativestories.com. I'll be glad to help. So finally, thank you so much for listening to me talking about podcasts. I appreciate you putting up with some of my geekier bits and bearing with me. Enjoy the rest of the festival, and I can't wait to hear more about all of the projects, digs and discoveries you've been involved in. My name's Chris Gregory. Thank you very much and goodbye.